Voice America. Live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and this is going to be quite a wide-ranging 2 hours. We'll be covering so many different topics. For just a minute, we'll be spending some time talking about the Center for Urban Renewal and Education. Going to talk about media bias. We'll get into some of the issues of fraud because of a very good piece by John Stossel. Get into a couple of other issues that I think are certainly relevant. Next hour, we will be talking with a guest, and we'll get us into a little bit of the America's Godly Heritage. And then we'll finish off looking at some misleading numbers from the U.S. Census and how to address some of the issues of poverty. That's just in the 2 hours. And, of course, tomorrow we'll have our Friday weekend edition. I've already put the articles together for that. That is going to be quite a conversation with Kelly Shackelford and Dr. Merrill Matthews. I bring now to the microphone Donald Eason. I heard about him, first of all, through our good friend Debbie Georgiadis. He was in town and was doing an interview with her, and she recommended that we get him on. And of course, I've heard him on with American Family Radio. Individual that brings a tremendous wealth of experience, both as a corporate executive and as a pastor. He served as the chairman of the board of directors for Outreach, which is a nonprofit organization there in Indiana. He's also been the chairman of the National Forum for Black Public Administrators, a variety of other organizations as well. He's been a state representative for our friends at the Family Research Council, special assistant to the president at Hillsdale College, Dr. Larry Arnn, but has been a minister for over 30 years as a pastor of a church in Michigan. As you might imagine, his credentials range from religious education in Midwestern Christian Institute, a bachelor's in business administration from Rochester College, as well as a master of public administration from City University of New York. So, Donald, it is a delight to have you on the program.
Hello, Kerby. Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to our discussion, and I'm glad to be here, as we say in the biblical world, for such a time as this.
One of the things that I think people will probably wonder about, and it came up yesterday or a couple of days ago when we were talking about you being on, people said, okay, what's happened to Star Parker? Of course, Star Parker has been the individual that started the Center for Urban Renewal and Education, which is CURE, C-U-R-E, but she has been wise enough to say that an individual of your talents certainly could best be used as the president of the center. And so in some respects, she's still involved, but you've been involved as well, haven't you?
Yes. That's a good question. Star is definitely still, I lean on Star. She started the Center for Urban Renewal and Education, as you know, about 30 years ago. And she was ready to move on and do something else. And so she's actually running for office in California. Mm-hmm. And she thought it was time to retire and hand over the reins. And I told her this, and to her credit, sometimes people start organizations, and when they leave, the organization dies. And she started something great here. Kerby and her and the board asked me if I would be willing to consider to be the president. They had been looking for a couple of years. I was blessed to meet Star, and this is something that's been on my heart, this kind of mission, for a long time. So I was honored to accept the position.
I might just mention we are going to talk about opportunity zones. Of course, I've known Scott Turner for many years, working with HUD, and matter of fact, one of the pastors at a church that I attend, as well as all sorts of other things that you're doing. But I thought, Donald, for just a minute, since it is Black History Month, and on Monday or Tuesday, I can't remember which, we did a very significant deep dive into some of that because of an article written by Colonel Alan West, who's been on the program with us many times, in which he pointed out that the Senate Minority Leader, that would be Chuck Schumer, referred to the attempt to try to have individuals show a photo ID if they wanted to vote, that's basically the same thing as Jim Crow. I thought maybe for just a minute you could help us understand, is it really Jim Crow 2.0 for asking an individual to show a photo ID before they vote?
Absolutely not. The Save America Act is literally what is called the Save America. There are at least two really important institutions in the public space that are important. One is, education, obviously. Of course, the church is important. And then three, our voting rights. So, and to say it's Jim Crow 2.0 would be to say for me to show my driver's license when I get on a plane. Kerby, I can remember when I played Little League Baseball, I had to have an ID. And so, and to me personally, because our mission here at Cure is to promote faith, freedom, family, and personal responsibility, and to show an ID is saying that we're a member of this country, we're a citizen of this country, and we're of age and have the right to vote. And to give people an opportunity to vote without an ID, I would actually say that our forefathers fought. There were some of our forefathers fought, were injured, and died for the right to vote. And for them to say that you don't need an ID to vote is really to take away all that we have fought for in this country. So it's definitely not Jim Crow 2.0. If anything, that they like to say is racist to have to require people to have an ID. I would argue that it's racist to not have people to have an ID, because you're taking away what a lot of black people in our heritage fought so we could vote in this country. And for to say you don't need an ID, that means you can come from anywhere in the world and vote in America if you don't have an ID. And I take offense to that.
Let me just mention that we do have a link to CURE, which is, again, the Center for Urban Renewal and Education. I do want to point you to a couple places. First of all, they have these policy reports on educational choice, the impact of abortion on the black community, the weight of a nation, homelessness in America, the whole issue of the trans youth phenomenon, black opinions and voting behavior, which, of course, is something we were just talking about a minute ago. I might also mention, of course, they also feature the book by Star Parker, which has an introduction and then features a number of individuals on the state of black progress. And I think in some respects, that's why I wanted you to come on the program, and maybe we could do a more extended one in the future, but just to educate people about the fact that right now, when we're dealing with issues of race, of tension, of political polarization, even a vote as to whether or not we should require a photo ID before someone votes, it's nice to know that there are places that individuals can go, especially for our African American listeners, places where they can go and recognize that there are very thoughtful, educated people like yourself who have written some of these policy papers and put these together so that you can have access to some of those resources. So I thought we'd take a break. When we come back, what I want to try to do is maybe get into some of the things we can do to help the urban environment, because that is certainly one aspect. You have been involved in collaboration with housing and urban development. Scott Turner now is the individual in that regard. Before that was Ben Carson. So again, very educated and very competent individuals there. But what can we do to begin to help people in the urban community? And then I want to broaden that to some of the other issues that you have been dealing with as well. It's all part of a very good organization called CURE, Center for Urban Renewal and Education. As you go to our website, pointofview.net, you can learn more about Donald and CURE, and we'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
What is the effect of social media on the brain? Nicholas Carr made this observation 14 years ago in an article in Atlantic. He said, over the past few years, I've had an uncomfortable sense that someone or something has been tinkering with my brain, remapping the neural circuitry, reprogramming the memory. In the book he later wrote, he blamed the internet and social media. We now have studies that seem to confirm what most of us suspected. Neuroscientists at the University of North Carolina conducted successive brain scans of middle schoolers. They found that children who habitually check their social media feeds at around age 12 showed a distinct trajectory, with their sensitivity to social rewards from peers heightening over time. At the same time, the researchers admit they can't show a firm cause and effect. Adolescents at a time of expanding social relationships have other factors that could be in play. Therefore, they acknowledge that they can't make causal claims that social media is changing the brain. While they may not be able to make a causal claim, I'm willing to do so for a very simple reason: neuroplasticity. I've talked about this in previous commentaries. We now know the brain is much more plastic and adapting to whatever stimulus we give it. One of the best examples of neuroplasticity occurs when we learn a new language. Neurons responsible for language acquisition will develop synapses in your brain. The authors also acknowledge that their findings do not capture the magnitude of brain changes, but only their trajectory. And they aren't even making the claim as to whether these changes are beneficial or harmful. But I think we all know that young people spend too much time in front of a screen, and that can't be good. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view on chemical abortion, go to viewpoints.info/chemical abortion. Viewpoints.info/chemical abortion. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again with Donald Eason. He is the president of CURE, which stands again for Center for Urban Renewal and Education. And Donald, I thought we might for just a minute talk about how we can bring maybe the body of Christ, especially pastors, especially inside the African-American community, but even outside as well, to have some kind of collaboration, because there has been this attempt to develop what are called opportunity zones. And that, I think, is a great opportunity to bring the church together with the government to empower individuals and break what I think is the ongoing chain and, if you will, sublimation of individuals in poverty. So how has CURE been working with HUD and other groups to turn that around and make a very significant change?
That's a very good question, Kerby. And we have partnered with our friends over at HUD to help with the opportunity zones, or getting the message out of opportunity zones that help in what we call some impoverished areas. If they start a business, the government will help them defer some of their costs, whether it's through taxes or also working with the SBA to get loans to help. As you know, one of our tenets is to reduce government dependency.
Yes.
And also part of the opportunity zones is transitional housing. Secretary Turner wants housing as we know it should be. People do need help from time to time, but he wants to make sure it's responsible housing opportunities and making it where it's transitional, where a person is responsible for if they need help with either it's mental illness or getting off of drugs, or they need to work, and make them responsible citizens, and instead of just totally dependency on the government. And so we're working with faith-based leaders, we're working with faith-based business leaders, we're working with pastors to get these messages out and to help their communities, help individuals either in their churches and communities to get off government dependency, and certainly transitional housing is one of the ways that we're doing it, and through opportunity zones.
And it does seem to me that that's very key, because I've said this before, that faith-based organizations are almost always more effective, because all government can do is throw money at it. But whether you're talking about drug rehabilitation, whether you're talking about getting people off the welfare rolls, and the best welfare program is work, because then you can support yourself. You're no longer dependent upon the government. The best kind of structure for young people is an intact family. So that kind of brings me back to something else. You're a pastor, so I'd love to have you talk for just a minute to our other pastors, because you have a clergy network, you have clergy resource center, you have some ways in which individuals in these communities can work with you, and you are providing leadership and resources so that they can really make a difference and remove people from being on the welfare rolls.
I literally just left a meeting with some of the members of our clergy network. And so I'm glad you brought up this question. We are definitely here to help the clergy. And one of the big ways that we help them, and you mentioned it earlier, through some of the policy papers and policy reports, to help educate our communities on the resources that they have available, especially when it comes to, let's just pick one topic, education choice. We're strong proponents of education choice. We're strong proponents of the family. And when it comes to the pastorate, there's something that's called the success sequence. It's actually in God's word in Jeremiah 29.
Yes.
It doesn't say the success sequence, obviously, in the scriptures, but it is what has been documented, that if you follow these steps, get an education, get a job, and get married before you have children, you are 90% likely to not go into poverty. And so that's what we have to, the pastors, with this kind of information. And certainly we have regular meetings with our pastors, and then we have a policy summit in October. We call it National Pastors Policy Summit, where we invite pastors to Washington, D.C. to get a chance to meet with some of the lawmakers. A lot of pastors at our last policy summit in this past October 2025 had an opportunity to hear from Scott Turner and to meet him and to question him, and then give their thoughts and opinions on what's needed in their communities. And I think this is important for pastors because, as you know, they have a big impact, a strong effect on the community. And one more note, Barna did a research, and I believe in the research, that even individuals within the urban community that do not attend church still listen to the pastor. And so we have this pastors network to help the pastors with their messaging and to develop that, what we call a biblical worldview.
Well, since you mentioned poverty, I thought for just a minute I might mention that later on in the program, I'm going to be reading from a piece by Senator John Kennedy having to do with the fact that if you look at the census numbers, we haven't done a very good job of addressing poverty, because he uses the examples that about 12% of Americans lived in poverty in 1974. Today, it's about 11%. But he is making the case, which also some other individuals like a former Senator Phil Gramm have made as well, and that is we never count the actual benefits, non-cash benefits and cash payments an individual receives in terms of course, that gets back to government dependency, but in terms of receiving income tax credits, child tax credits, SNAP, all those other things. If you do that calculation, the people below the poverty line is 1%. So obviously, right now, the government is keeping people dependent, and yet at the same time telling government that they need to spend more and more money funneling it into welfare. And we're going to talk about welfare fraud in just a minute from a piece that John Stossel's put together. And it seems to me that there's a better solution. That is, give individuals who are able-bodied an opportunity to go to work, give them a chance to get out of this culture of poverty, and recognize that if we could do that, we would save ultimately trillions of dollars over these many decades that we have spent on a welfare program that has just made people more dependent and less likely to control their future destiny.
I agree with you. The single best way, outside of obviously being in God's kingdom, the individual's personal responsibility is giving them meaningful work to take care of themselves. God has given each one of us unique abilities and skills to be a contributing member to society and to our communities, and people even feel better about themselves. They have more dignity when they have work, and I think that's one of the things that has hurt our society is a lot of our jobs have gone overseas, and this administration is bringing back a lot of those positions, and I believe that will bring back the dignity that people want. It'll help them reduce government dependency, and they'll have lasting solutions to stay out of poverty.
One of the things I wanted to do is, of course, introduce you today to our audience, and I certainly would encourage people to go to curepolicy.org. Of course, we have all the links already on our website. As you mentioned, there's an opportunity for people to look at your books, your policy papers, your policy reports. There's a place where individuals can contact you, donate. But also, just before we finish, let's again just encourage maybe some pastors who are either in an urban environment or could maybe joint venture with some church in an urban environment, because there's a whole place for clergy, and you have this clergy network and a whole set of clergy resource centers, which I would encourage people to find out more about if they really are concerned about urban renewal and concerned about individuals who are caught in a culture of poverty. So as people go to your website, they can click on some of those buttons, and if they would want to contact you, that is possible, and you might even be available to come out and speak to their group, wouldn't you?
Absolutely, Kerby. Thank you so much. Yes, they can go to our website, curepolicy.org, and find all the information you just mentioned, and we would love to come out and speak to their communities on any of these topics that will help encourage them and empower them.
Well, again, I know you're a busy person, but I wanted to get at least a little bit of time with you today. Next time you're in Dallas, certainly it was great you were on with Debbie Georgiadis, but come over to our studio too. We'll put you on and would love to educate people more about some of these issues. But I think the first step for everybody, just simply go to curepolicy.org or just follow the link that we have on the website, and you will find a lot of great information, and that might encourage you to make a difference in your community. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, I do want to get into some of these issues because there is a lot happening, including a decision that was made today to pull various troops, if you will as individuals with ICE out of Minneapolis. We're going to talk about what that means. The Department of Homeland Security has made some changes there. And then we'll get into all sorts of aspects of the conversation that we have today. Later in the next hour, we'll be talking as well about America's godly heritage, Christian roots in the founding of this country. It's America 250, so I know we will continue talking about that. But let's take a break. We'll be back right after this.
Have you ever met a child you knew would do great things? They displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, and a zest for learning. Now imagine someone takes that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, they feed them nothing but lies. You know, that scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from the mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we can talk about a few things in the news. And speaking at a press conference just a few hours ago, the border czar, Tom Homan, said that they are bringing an end to what's called Operation Metro Surge. And that means that many of those immigration agents and other individuals associated with the federal government, whether it's ICE or even various military, are going to actually be withdrawn. And of course, what you are dealing with is a significant down draw, and it will probably take place. And in the press conference, he was willing to acknowledge that they didn't necessarily do everything right, but nevertheless, he made it very clear that if you're in the country illegally, you're not off the table. Immigration officers and agents have arrested in round numbers about 4,000 people since the operation began. That's according to the Department Department of Homeland Security did not break down how many of those had criminal charges. Interestingly enough, there's been a real back and forth, which we'll get into probably next week because it's worth getting the facts right, between CBS, which says only a fraction of the individuals that have been arrested had a criminal behavior or actual argument, or I guess it'd be a list against them. But nevertheless, there seems to be a lot of question as to whether or not those initial numbers, both given by the Department of Homeland Security and more recently by CBS, are accurate. And so we'll dig in and see what we can come up with. But nevertheless, this is a retreat in some respects. I suspect we may be hearing from the governor, from the mayor, maybe even a little bit of spiking the football, saying, well, we drove them out, and many people wonder whether that then means that some of those individuals that were paid activists just moved from one place to the next, but we will see. What it does is certainly when we will be talking about this issue of welfare reform, and tomorrow we're even going to talk about Obamacare reform and some of the fraud and the rest. Matter of fact, interestingly enough, John Stossel referred to his latest video piece as Fraud Nation. Now when we talk about Minnesota or Minneapolis, you know that we'll be talking about the fraud. We won't be talking about what was happening in the streets. And that may be a positive because up until now, I think most people have focused so much on what's in the streets instead of just the incredible amount of money, and we'll get to that in just a minute, that has been wasted in waste, fraud, and abuse, and especially this issue of fraud. So we'll get into that, but part of the problem is that the way the press covers these stories, and that leads to my first article, and it's by our good friend Robert Knight. Matter of fact, I've got some commentaries coming out next week using some other Robert Knight columns, but this one is about the Washington Post. Now, if you look at the article either in the Washington Times where it was published or even on our website at pointofview.net, you'll see a picture of a W and a P, which just stands for Washington Post, and then 3 blind mice. So I thought that's pretty good because his original was called The Washington Post and the Consequences of Woke Reporting. Now some have just simply referred to it as the Washington Post and bias reporting. But either way, he gets into this in large part because Peggy Noonan, who we've had on the program before, and matter of fact, last time Peggy Noonan was speaking at the Council for Life, I was privileged to introduce her, and I like her, and she is an individual that wrote for Ronald Reagan, but in this particular case writes a piece about her lament for the fact that the Washington Post has let people go. We did talk about that earlier in the week, and part of it has to do with the fact that newspapers themselves aren't doing very well. But it also has to do with the kind of reporting that has come from the Washington Post. And Robert Knight goes on to say that journalists are supposed to keep government in check, not to empower it. He says, however, the Post has done the opposite, cheerleading for an ever-growing federal government at the expense of the rest of society. He says it has championed every single destructive trend in sexuality, thus weakening marriage, family, churches, and other government foundations. When these institutions fall apart, back to the conversation we had just a minute ago with Donald Eason, the government has to pick up the pieces and we have to pay more for it. And he points out that the particular technique, and Robert Knight used to work for the Los Angeles Times and he's worked for a lot of media organizations, so he's wise to this. He says the Washington Post will tell a story about a victim. And he says 80 to 90-inch stories on the victim topped off with what? At the end, a plea for greater government involvement. And so his concern with Peggy Noonan was, she laments the loss of one major newspaper left in the great nation's capital. And he says she doesn't spend even one word on the 4 more credible Washington Times, which is where this particular column is taken from, one for which, of course, he writes a weekly column. And so even if the Washington Post ceased to exist, and it's not, but it's certainly going to be rather significantly reduced in terms of staff, it still is going to have an impact. And he goes on a little bit later to say, look, like Peggy Noonan, I lament the decline of newspapers, but I won't shed any tears, he says, if legacy media outlets such as the Post are cut down to size. They are so consumed by ideological bias that the reporters become a euphemism, spouting caricatures rather than truth tellers. And one example he uses is on Super Bowl Sunday, with the Winter Olympics in full swing, what did the Washington Post sports section do? By the way, they're cutting that down rather significantly. They featured 2/3 of a front page lamenting the absence of Colin Kaepernick, a former San Francisco 49er quarterback who led players in sitting or taking a knee during the Star-Spangled Banner 10 years ago to protest police violence and racial injustice. So of all the things you could be talking about in terms of sports, you have a Super Bowl on Sunday. We right now, or most of us, are watching the Olympics, the Winter Olympics. And what do they cover? Colin Kaepernick. If that doesn't show the problem, I think you can certainly see as you read through the rest of his piece how significant it is. He reminds us that the Washington Post masthead still declares democracy dies in darkness. It's a great line, but unfortunately, it doesn't work very well, because he says, in a woke newsroom, so does grammar, plain English, and common sense. And I left out some things so that you could understand why he talks about grammar and plain English, but you'll get the idea if you read the piece. It is quite readable. As always, Robert Knight really is a very good writer and a good communicator. And just again, not trying to pick a fight with Peggy Noonan. We like Peggy Noonan, but I'm not so sure if some of us lament the fact that the Washington Post has had to downsize, as has almost every other company. And yet you would think it was the end of the Republic as we know it, because they had to let some of the staffers go. And I think it illustrates why, in some respects, some of the people in the business of journalism take themselves just a little too seriously. I thought I'd also just mention real quickly, we're going to get into this later, about how the press also can't seem to figure out what's going on. We'll talk about this in terms of crime rates in the next hour, but I thought to get into it real quickly, I'll just pick a piece from the Babylon Bee, because they say, with the horrific news breaking of yet another mass shooting at a school, the media has remained completely stumped as to anything recent mass shooters would have in common. Journalists desperately pored over the profiles of mass shooters over the last 4 years, hoping to find any sort of similarity. As a CNN journalist saying, how could this be? They go through this whole long list of trying to figure it out. And finally, at the end, the journalists conclude, well, the only thing the mass shooters had in common were that they were white. You probably know where I'm going with this. The most recent mass shooting in a school was a trans shooter once again. And if you are not familiar, that's at least the third very visible. There's some others that are certainly associated with that. Trans shooters in schools. And yet this inability, matter of fact, this may be the first time some of you even hear that this last mass shooter was a trans individual, because the media just simply doesn't cover it, because they're just deeply puzzled by why all these shootings are taking place. And I think it's an illustration, again, that there are just certain topics for the legacy media that are just have, if you will, do not trespass signs in front of them. They are just off the table and cannot be talked about. And it's, I think, a very good corollary to the piece that Robert Knight wrote about the Washington Post and the consequences of woke reporting. Well, let's take a break. When we come back, I did mention something that Senator John Kennedy has elucidated, and that is the fact that if you, again, just look at the raw numbers, doesn't look like we've done a very good job of helping the poor. But if you add in all the non-cash payments, yeah, we have done a little bit better. And there's a reason why I think in many cases government doesn't count those, because that would then stifle the desire to spend more money on welfare. We'll talk about that right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's see if we can get into one other issue, and I mentioned this a few minutes ago when we were talking with Donald Eason, because Senator John Kennedy has introduced into legislation a piece of legislation that probably will not be passed, and you'll understand why in just a minute, called the Poverty Statistics Enhancement Act. And the reason for that is that he points out in a very good piece that we've posted for you to read that ultimately, what we are dealing with right now is a subset of Census Bureau numbers which paint a very misleading picture of poverty. Let me explain. He says over the past 50 years, the federal government's welfare spending has increased by 765%. Yet the percentage of people living below the poverty line hasn't budged. Roughly 12% of Americans lived in poverty in 1974. That is today roughly 11%. So it is a question that you might ask is America really that bad at bringing people out of poverty? He says some of my Democratic colleagues would answer that question with a resounding yes and argue that we need to spend more than the $1.4 trillion we already spend on welfare to fix the problem. But he says it really matters on how you define poverty. So far. Okay, let's give you the numbers. The poverty level in the United States is $16,000 for a single person, $21,000 for a family of two, $27,000 for a family of three, $32,000 for a family of four. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, then, 35.9 million Americans have incomes that are at or below the poverty line. That's a lot. When the Census Bureau calculates a family income, determine whether it falls below the poverty line, however, it does not consider non-cash benefits that individuals may receive from federal, state, and local governments, such as health insurance and housing subsidies. And again, the argument is that this is only fair because they can't spend non-cash benefits on anything they want. Yes, but money is fungible. If I don't have to spend any money on housing, I can spend it on something else. If I don't have to spend it on health care, I can spend it on something else. So giving someone Medicaid frees that person up to spend on something other than health care or other aspects of health care. This is why he says that this narrow poverty definition by the Census Bureau is misleading. Okay, let's get back to this then. You heard the 11% number, which is virtually no different than the 12% number 50 years ago. But if you then add into those non-cash benefits as well as cash payments, this is from a person's earning from the federal government, depends on what you're talking about here, the actual percentage of people with incomes at or below the poverty line is only 1%. Okay, that makes a difference. It also gets you into something we'll talk about next hour, because I'm going to be talking about the piece by John Stossel about welfare fraud, because there are some real benefits that come from this, but also there's another part of that, and that is there any impetus to get off of dependency, because then you lose all of those non-cash benefits. Let's just take for instance, and we've done this before on Point of View, and it's really kind of eye-opening. Single mom, 2 kids, making $11,000 a year in part-time work, is also eligible to receive more than $4,000 in refundable earned income tax credits and $3,400 in refundable child tax credits, and $9,200 in food stamps, $9,500 in housing subsidies, $900 in utility bill subsidies, $16,000 in Medicaid, and $3,100 a year in free school meals, as well as, of course, the obvious welfare payments, which are $6,600 in what are called TNNF welfare payments. That's a lot of money. If you add it all up, and I don't know that any of you were adding all of it up in your head, so let me help you out. That means that when you add both the cash and non-cash benefits, she has a total income of, drum roll please, $64,000. That's 237% higher than the $27,000 poverty line for a family of three. Let's think of it another way. These non-cash benefits are also tax-free. So a middle-income family making $64,000 in income would still have to pay taxes on the $64,000, whereas the individual, this would be a single mom with two kids, would have $64,000 free, essentially. I mean, part of it went to taxes, but insignificant amount. And so you can see that raises two issues. Number one, we're not doing a very good job of comparing the financial status of individuals. If you want an apples to apples comparison, then how much money do you have that even if some of it is restricted, still you have $64,000, and that is identical and even better than the person who makes $64,000 and has to pay taxes on the $64,000. You follow me? I know it's hard to follow sometimes money on radio, but I think it illustrates again that, number one, even if we were to do an apples-to-apples comparisons, it's not completely fair because one has to pay taxes, the other does not. But the other issue is it also shows why people don't want to get off the welfare rolls. Just think of all the things that a single mom would lose if she were to go and get a better education and a better job, even if she was making $64,000 a year. Well, she'd have to pay for childcare. She'd have to pay for the transportation, whether she'd have a car or take a bus or whatever. You can see that there are some almost major financial hurdles that are keeping people from getting off of government dependency, which was the very conversation we had just a few minutes ago with Donald Eason. And I think the other part of it is that there is a need to try to clean this up. Now, fortunately, Senator John Kennedy talks about the fact that the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office has designed a new way to measure poverty in America. The CBO's methodology takes into consideration a family's access to both cash and non-cash welfare programs, and this provides a clearer picture of a family's ability to pay for its basic needs. But at a time when we are talking about evidence of massive welfare fraud, we see it he mentions Minnesota and California. I can mention some other states, but that's sufficient enough. And when we are a nation $38 trillion in debt, he says we cannot afford to let misleading survey numbers dupe the country into more costly, fraud-prone welfare programs. If I were to have the next segment, I would get into our piece with John Stossel on Fraud Nation. But later in the next hour, we will get into that because we have all sorts of evidence of a massive amount of fraud. And we are talking, as we will tomorrow, about welfare fraud, about Obamacare fraud, and even voter fraud. And so those are some of the fraud issues that I decided we might want to come back and talk about on Friday. Many of those are topics that Dr. Merrill Matthews has written about, has a book on the subject about, and certainly we'll get into that. Of course, with Kelly Shackelford, we'll get into the National Religious Liberty Commission, which has had kind of a rough week. And we'll get into some of that as well. Let's take a break, though. If you'd like to read a couple of these articles, they are available at the website, pointofview.net. They're the kind of questions maybe you need to ask your elected representative about. And so we're going to take a break, come back with more right after this.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give the point of view today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, going to spend just a little bit of time talking about, of course, America 250. And you might remember the conversation we had just recently with our friend, Dr. Mark David Hall. Did America have a Christian founding? We, of course, met him years and years ago when he came into studio. I think at that time he was at George Fox College, and we've, of course, followed him ever since. And we spent some time talking about his book. By the way, I have a booklet coming out in the future, which is sort of like the Cliff's Notes version of his book. And we certainly want to educate you as much as we can about America's founding. And so we thought another voice that you needed to hear was Jeffry Morrison. He is professor of American Studies at Christopher Newport University, right there in Newport News area. Is an individual also that is a senior academic advisor to the federal government's James Madison Memorial Fellowship. He's taught at the University of Virginia, Princeton University, of course, Regent University, Georgetown University. As a matter of fact, he earned his PhD in government from Georgetown University, has a home in Williamsburg, Virginia, on a Revolutionary War battlefield. And Dr. Morrison, it is a delight to bring you to the program today.
Well, Kerby, thank you very much, and I'm pleased to join you.
I thought I might, for just a minute, mention this new book that I've been reading by Jonathan Turley, Rage and the Republic. And I noticed the other day that he posted that he's going to be speaking at Christopher Newport University on Monday, which is President's Day, about 3 p.m. in the Gaines Theater. It's part of the annual conference on America's founding principles. Of course, I have mentioned many times his book on free speech. This one gets you a little bit more into some other aspects of America's founding. So I don't know if you've had a chance to read the book, but I know you're going to have a chance to hear from him on Monday.
I will. I have not read it. Professor Turley has been to our campus a number of times, and he's I don't know about frequent, but he's a regular speaker here, and we're very pleased to have him coming on Monday, as you mentioned.
Well, again, if you can pass on to him, we, of course, oftentimes mention his book on free speech. And, of course, we are very dedicated to this idea of free speech, and that is certainly something. And when I saw, first of all, the interview he did with Mark Levin, and then I saw that Mark Levin endorsed it and all the rest, I thought it's something we will cover in the future. So maybe I can even find out a little bit more how his speech goes there. But let me, if I can, for just a minute, talk about some of the things that you're involved with. I noticed that you're working on a new piece on the political writings of John Witherspoon. And I remember when your book came out, John Witherspoon and the Founding of the American Republic, a Scottish Presbyterian minister, one of the founding fathers. Oftentimes, you know, Dr. Morrison, people say, well, I got to keep politics and religion separate. But here is an individual who was the president of the College of New Jersey, later become Princeton. He was also one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, gave a very famous sermon that in some respects encouraged people to sign the Declaration of Independence. So we can learn a great deal from John Witherspoon, and I know that is something that you spent a fair amount of your time researching.
It is, and he's a fascinating character. I have sometimes referred to him as the grandfather of the Constitution, because of his close relationship with James Madison,
yes,
known as the father. And also I've referred to him semi-jocularly as the most interesting founding father you've never heard of. So he's kind of in that second rank of founders who were very influential, very important, crucial indeed. You mentioned that he signed the Declaration of Independence. In fact, he's the only practicing clergyman to sign the Declaration. He contributed to its language, at least in my opinion. He also contributed to and signed our first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. He was a ratifier in the New Jersey Ratifying Convention of our current Constitution of 1787 and 88. So that gives him a direct hand in 3 of the 4 so-called organic laws of the United States. And he's right at the center, the epicenter, in and around Philadelphia and Princeton during the crucial years of the American Revolution, goes back into the New Jersey legislature.
He's, again, very important individual. I might hold up our booklet on One Nation Under God because near the end I talk about the fact that some people have suggested that, if nothing else, it was John Witherspoon's Calvinism that emphasized the fallen nature of man that really influenced James Madison, because we have this idea of checks and balances that in many cases are rooted back to the idea that ambition should rival ambition, and that men are not angels. Some of the phrases out of the Federalist Papers, another one of the booklets we have. And so in some respects, as you said, John Witherspoon may be one of the most important founding fathers that nobody's ever heard of.
Yes, and I think you're right about the Calvinistic influence. It's not the only influence that causes our founders to build in those checks and balances. You see them, for example, in the Roman Republic before it becomes a kind of corrupt empire. So it was not a necessary condition for checks and balances, it being Calvinist Christianity, but it certainly is the immediate context in the British North American colonies, and Witherspoon, and we've mentioned Madison already a couple of times. The main intellectual influences on James Madison were Calvinist ministers. His boarding school principal and tutor, his principal influence in his college years, which are the formative years, aren't they? 18 to 20, 21, 22, was John Witherspoon. And in fact, after Madison graduated from the College of New Jersey, he stayed on essentially another academic year to privately be tutored by Witherspoon in 2 subjects, law and Hebrew, which tells us that, number one, Madison was thinking about going into the ministry as a vocation, and secondly, that he was thinking about going into the law, which he did not do, but that training served him very well, of course, when he became one of our first career politicians. So a very, very, at least intellectually, close relationship between Witherspoon and Madison. So my kind of semi-jocular referring to Witherspoon as the grandfather of the Constitution.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, I'd love to pull a little bit out of your book on the political philosophy of George Washington, trying to, I guess, maybe rehabilitate a little bit of those ideas, which will bring us into were all these founders deist or agnostic, or were they actually church-going individuals? What were some of the ideas that were there? Certainly they, as you are already have pointed out, pulling from a number of things, the Greek and Roman writers, but also pulling from Hobbes and Locke and even Adam Smith and their Protestant Christian ideas. So we'll come back and get into a little more detail about that. But if you are familiar or would like to know more about Jeffry Morrison, we do have a link to some of the information there. And I did post at least information about one of his books, The Political Philosophy of George Washington, The Political Philosophy of the American Founders. And of course, we have a link to the Christopher Newport University. We'll come back and continue our conversation with Dr. Morrison right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
What is the effect of social media on the brain? Nicholas Carr made this observation 14 years ago in an article in Atlantic. He said, over the past few years, I've had an uncomfortable sense that someone or something has been tinkering with my brain, remapping the neural circuitry, reprogramming the memory. In the book he later wrote, he blamed the internet and social media. We now have studies that seem to confirm what most of us suspected. Neuroscientists at the University of North Carolina conducted successive brain scans of middle schoolers. They found that children who habitually check their social media feeds at around age 12 showed a distinct trajectory, with their sensitivity to social rewards from peers heightening over time. At the same time, the researchers admit they can't show a firm cause and effect. Adolescents at a time of expanding social relationships have other factors that could be in play. Therefore, they acknowledge that they can't make causal claims that social media is changing the brain. While they may not be able to make a causal claim, I'm willing to do so for a very simple reason: neuroplasticity. I've talked about this in previous commentaries. We now know the brain is much more plastic and adapting to whatever stimulus we give it. One of the best examples of neuroplasticity occurs when we learn a new language. Neurons responsible for language acquisition will develop synapses in your brain. The authors also acknowledge that their findings do not capture the magnitude of brain changes, but only their trajectory. And they aren't even making the claim as to whether these changes are beneficial or harmful. But I think we all know that young people spend too much time in front of a screen, and that can't be good. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view on chemical abortion, go to viewpoints.info/chemical abortion. Viewpoints.info/chemical abortion.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Jeffry Morrison, talking about the Christian roots of America's founding. And, of course, if you pull up almost any textbook or certainly sit in some classes on American history, you'll hear about deism, and you'll be told in many cases that the founders weren't all that Christian, they weren't all that church-going, and they weren't that interested in those issues. But I think we certainly need to come back and look at this with a little more nuance and understanding. Were they influenced by various ideas? First of all, there were a good number of them that were in churches and did have Orthodox Christian views, but others did not. But perhaps one of the great puzzles, Dr. Morrison, has always been George Washington. And yet, interestingly enough, what you write about is the fact that we know George Washington as the general, as the individual who later resigned his military activity and went back to Mount Vernon, and then once again was willing to serve for a time as president. But you also make the case that he was a political thinker, a political philosopher, and blended some of these ideas of the Greeks and Romans with kind of the British liberal ideas and even some of the Protestant Christian ideas. Can you help us understand how to make sense of George Washington in that regard?
I'll try. It's a very good question, and he is a bit of an enigma, Washington. By the way, the title of that book was given to me by Johns Hopkins University Press in that series that you mentioned,
right.
The Political Philosophy of American Founders. So I would probably prefer to refer to him as a political thinker.
Yes.
Simply because philosopher is such a highfalutin term, and he's not exactly James Madison or even Thomas Jefferson. But I'd like, Kerby, if you don't mind, to zero in on that question of deism that you raised just before the break. In fact, we were just talking about this in a class literally yesterday here at Christopher Newport, where we have a wonderful Center for American Studies, by the way. It's that center which is putting on the conference you mentioned, where Professor Turley's coming down on Monday. And so the question came up. We were looking at the Declaration of Independence and its claim that all men are created equal, and I was talking as well about the 4 references to the deity that are in that declaration. And was Jefferson, the principal draftsman of the Declaration, a deist or what? A skeptic or Christian of some variety? So the same question can be asked of George Washington. But what I showed the students was a passage from Thomas Jefferson's the only book he ever wrote in his long life, Notes on the State of Virginia, so-called Query 18, query is a fancy word for question, in which he is talking about race relations in Virginia and slavery, and he says, I tremble for my country, he meant Virginia, when I consider that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. And then he says that there may be a reversal in the revolution of the wheel of fortune. In other words, perhaps the slaves will be on top sometime in the future and the masters on the bottom. And he says that this may happen by supernatural interference. And then he has an exclamation point. So you don't tremble for your country if you think that God is the stereotypical deist God, the watchmaker of the universe, who winds up the watch, puts the key in his pocket and walks away.
Yes.
You tremble if you are concerned that God will judge nations, states, individuals like Jefferson himself for the sin of slavery. So if Jefferson was a deist, that's a very strange way, a stereotypical deist, I should say.
Yes.
That's a very strange way to be writing. And Washington, in a variety of places, writes of his firm belief, and writes consistently, firm belief that God intervenes in human affairs. So the stereotypical portrait we have of even the famous quasi-skeptical founders, we'll certainly put Jefferson in that category, and Franklin in the category, perhaps Washington, is just wrong-headed if by deism we mean, again, a watchmaker God who creates the universe, injects energy into it, and then walks away and has nothing to do and no interest in human affairs or morality or whatnot. So that does not seem to be the portrait of even the famous founders. Now, you mentioned earlier...
Well, let me jump in real quickly because, Benjamin Franklin would fit into that, because I remember the quote from Benjamin Franklin, the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs the affairs of men. That doesn't sound like a person that believes that God walked away either. And, of course, Thomas Jefferson, you just gave that quote. So if indeed it is the idea that God set the world in motion and then abstained from all human affairs, they don't even qualify as deists, do they?
They don't. Under that definition of deist. So I think we have a very imperfect and far too sort of garden variety definition of deism. It's inaccurate, and it certainly is inapplicable to even the so-called skeptical founders.
Yes.
Now, we know a lot about 6 of the founding fathers: George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, because they left behind enormous paper trails. They were self-conscious about both the unique American experiment in which they were playing large outsized roles, but also of their own place in history. But the overwhelming majority of founders about whom we know much less, John Witherspoon, one of those, James Wilson, Charles Thompson, Secretary of the Continental Congress, the list goes on and on, John Jay. All of these people are some variety of Christian and far more conventionally orthodox in their religious beliefs and practices. So we get a skewed view, I think, of the religiosity or lack thereof of the founders by focusing only on those 6. And of those 6, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin are on record questioning the historicity of the scriptures and whether miracles occur and so on and so forth. But what I think is even more important than the private religious beliefs of a few of the most famous founders is what they said and wrote and did about the important role of religion in preserving and sort of armoring a democratic/Republican people against the excesses that they saw in the ancient world. They saw Rome go from being a republic to a corrupt empire. They saw Athens, right, become the head of of an empire for all intents and purposes, and engage in a ruinous war with Sparta. So how do we protect against the mistakes that ancient democracies made? Well, one way we do that is to make sure, or hope for, at the very least, a robust church that will produce good democratic citizens.
Yes.
So
Civic
regardless
virtue.
of whether,
Yeah.
yes, so to come back to Washington, since you raised him, regardless of what Washington's private views may have been about Christianity, and incidentally, he never spoke in public or in private disrespectfully about Christianity the way that Thomas Jefferson did. So that sets Washington apart immediately from him.
Well,
But,
again, I just want to encourage
what do
people
they
to
do?
get some of your books because obviously we're coming close to a break here, but I was just thinking of all the resources that are available. And if people wanted to contact you and maybe have you come and speak, maybe they'd like to read some of your books on John Witherspoon and George Washington and some of the other works, that's available as well, isn't it?
It is, yes. And thank you for the plug. And yes, I'd be happy to speak in whatever venues might be presented to me, and have enjoyed doing that throughout my career, and this program in particular. So thank you again for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Let me just mention, too, that you are at Christopher Newport University, and you have this American Studies program, and if you really wanted to study that, it is a place I would highly recommend. And if nothing else, I'm hoping we can have you back in the future because I've been familiar with you. I'm thrilled that you're going to have Jonathan Turley there talking about Rage and the Republic, the unfinished story of the American Revolution. And so certainly we wanted to educate people, so thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
My pleasure again. Thank you, Kerby.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, let's get into some of these issues. Let me hold up our booklet on One Nation Under God. We also mentioned the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers written by some of the people we just mentioned, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay. And these are resources we want to put in your hands and certainly encourage you to learn more. This is the 250th anniversary of this country, and maybe you've learned some things today. We hope to continue to educate you, and we'll be right back.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday, in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, about a half an hour left, and we will cover a couple of issues which we did touch on in the first hour, one having to do with welfare, the other having to do with media bias. I thought I'd wind down in the last segment, though, with the Clintons and the Jeffrey Epstein affair. That itself is almost an entire program, but I thought I'd at least make a mention of it because we're learning a lot more, and it's not good. And frankly, you can't even say on the air some of the things we're learning from the Epstein files, but we'll cover that as well. Let me just mention that tomorrow we will have Dr. Merrill Matthews and Kelly Shackelford with us. Kelly Shackelford is one that sits on the National Religious Liberty Commission. And first of all, the National Religious Liberty Commission has now been sued by an interfaith group because they say they're too narrow-minded. And yet, of course, that was when they were actually not covering Christianity, but covering anti-Semitism. But nevertheless, you had that suit. So I wanted to get his thoughts about that. Our second article is about the fact that one of the members of the National Religious Liberty Commission went on this kind of rant, which was very similar to Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson and some of that. And so she has been removed, and I wanted to get his perspective on that since he was there when that unfolded. And who would have thought that the National Religious Liberty Commission would be so controversial, but I guess we should have known better. We are going to spend some time talking about Obamacare fraud. Dr. Merrill Matthews has done a lot of research there. Welfare fraud, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute and get into more detail of that. And then voter fraud because of the vote that is taking place. The vote just took place on the House. They voted on it in April of last year, voted on a kind of revised version just the other day. And, of course, they're waiting to see if the Senate will do anything on the so-called SAFE Act. We'll get into that tomorrow. And then a couple other things. One of the issues we talked about earlier in the week is how some of these major medical organizations, like the American Medical Association, said, maybe we shouldn't be involved in transgender surgery on minors. This might be a problem. And a couple other things that have come from congressional hearings on Sharia law, where the Democrats the whole time didn't want to admit that there was a problem with Muslims, radical Muslims or Sharia law. They just kept saying the words Christian nationalism, Christian nationalism. Really, is that the best you have? But anyway, we'll get into some of that tomorrow in more detail, and those are just a few ideas of some of the topics we will address. So if you don't have a chance to listen to it, you might pull down as we make available the audio as well as the video so that you can follow that. But let's get back to this issue of fraud. It is huge. And we're learning more every day. John Stossel did a video. I watched the video, and then, of course, as always, he produces a transcript, or actually it's more of a summary of the transcript, and it goes on for 4 pages, but he calls it Fraud Nation. He says Americans want to help people in need, but when government does that, about $500 billion in taxpayer dollars gets stolen. And so he tells you about this particular video he did with an individual who works in the issue of welfare fraud, Andrew McClanahan, in which he says the problem is you're measuring success in the government by how much money you put out. And, of course, the example he uses is Minnesota, and government officials didn't uncover the fraud. A YouTuber, a 20-year-old with a phone, basically uncovered all of this. And then it wasn't like it was a great surprise, because we had heard stories before of people with suitcases full of money leaving. But nevertheless, there were articles going all the way back to 2018 of millions of dollars in suitcases being flown out of Minnesota to Somalia. So it's not like this was news. And, of course, what they did was then freeze billions in welfare payments. That led, of course, Representative Ilhan Omar to say they're creating chaos and confusion, trying to intimidate people. Governor Tim Walz says, well, this is on my watch, I'm accountable, but you didn't do anything about the fraud. And the reason for this is that there isn't a lot of incentive. There isn't a lot of accountability to do so. Department of Justice estimates just in 2024, probably $2.9 billion. And that's probably a low estimate, but we'll take that one. And so the argument is, well, we can't stop it. And that's when, of course, this individual, Andrew McClanahan, says, yeah, we can. It just takes a few seconds to verify things. But he points out, and if you watch the video, it's pretty disturbing because Elon Musk, remember him from Doge, pointed out that a lot of these government records are printed. They're stored in really a part of the mountain there in a salt deposit, and they're not even digitized. And so The poor record keeping makes fraud very easy to understand. And I'll just use, since we've been picking on Minnesota, let's pick on another state. And for those of you in California, you won't like this, but this is what we found. The state of California gave phone subsidies to 94,000 accounts of dead people. And again, this is one of the things where Andrew McClanahan says everybody knows the United States is the easiest game in town. And of course, some of those funds go in the pockets of Americans. Some of those funds went to the pockets of alleged terrorists. In addition, he says many state politicians don't try to find fraud. Handouts mostly come from the federal government, so local politicians reason, well, people in other states pay, but my taxes collect, so why should I make a big effort to stop it? And as a matter of fact, the one time lately in which there was an attempt to address that, President Donald Trump gave investigators more access to state data. That would be so that you could catch the fraud. And what did the states do? Well, the states are suing the government, and there's a link to there. You can find out more about that as well. So what can be done? Can we actually deal with fraud? Dr. Merrill Matthews will talk about that more tomorrow, but he points out, that is Andrew McClanahan, that first of all, you can prevent the fraud from going out in the first place. It isn't that hard to actually validate whether or not that address is true and that person exists. And so if we really were serious about getting rid of fraud, then I think there are some very important ways to change that. So again, we talked about fraud and we talked about the welfare issue and talked about the Census Bureau numbers that I think misrepresent how many people are actually in poverty. But we also talked about media bias, and I gave you some stories about how it's hard sometimes for people in the media to really figure things out. And this, I think, is a good illustration. Picked on today, the Washington Times. How about the Washington Post? How about the New York Times? A headline in the New York Times: what's behind the staggering drop in the murder rate? No one knows for sure. Now, if you've been listening to Point of View, you know a while back we actually did go into some detail for why the violent crime rate was going down precipitously. And it turns out that if you look at those numbers, all 7 categories of violent crime that have been tracked are following below the pre-pandemic levels. But the New York Times editors were having a difficult time trying to figure out why a drop in crime. And yet I think the issue is pretty simple. That is, the president has been sending federal troops into some of those crime-ridden areas. This article goes into that in some detail, but it also doesn't mention something else. If you take individuals who are here illegally, who have committed a crime, and you deport them, we also have pointed out that many others are self-deporting because sooner or later they figure they're going to be caught. So we're removing criminals from the streets by putting them in prison, or at least jailing them, and we're removing other criminals from the streets because we're sending them to another country. And so as a result, after all that, isn't this interesting? Axios says, well, since the crime rate is going down, that's why President Trump should stop sending troops to Chicago, Portland, Washington, D.C., Memphis, and other places. And I love what some of the people on Twitter said. So here, you're ignoring the cause while promoting the effect. In other words, the cause for why the crime rate is going down is then justification for you for actually removing what is causing the crime rate to go down. Do you get that? If nothing else, I love this. One of the posts here. So the Trump crackdown reduced crime in major cities. One of the people said, either you're idiots or you think your readers are. Or, as one other person said it, Scott Jennings, you hear him on CNN all the time, he says, oh, so we really don't know why the murder rate is going down. Scott Jennings said, funny way of saying crime went down because of Trump. Well, if nothing else, They're having trouble figuring out what is the motivation for some of the trans shooters. They're having trouble figuring out why the crime rate is going down. I think you know the answer. It's called common sense. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. I thought for nothing else we would wind down by at least mentioning the Epstein files. We are learning quite a bit. And the things that we're learning are, first of all, how many of these elites just have such lack of respect, such disdain for you and me, just the average person in America. We're learning how deeply involved some individuals, politicians, and we're talking about people in Congress, people that have served in the cabinet, maybe even presidents, not maybe, I think we know that now, are all involved. We've recognized how, in some respects, this has been just a good reminder of how we have known about this for some time. It's not like people didn't know who Jeffrey Epstein was, or that they didn't know what they were getting into when they flew to what was called Epstein Island, or even if they went to St. Thomas and found a way to get over there quietly. We have, of course, many of the victims that have surfaced, and we know their names, but others were supposed to be redacted, but the Justice Department didn't do a real good job of redacting some of those names, and so we have both problems, some things that are redacted that shouldn't have been redacted, and others, especially victims, that should have been redacted from the 3,000, was it? No, 3 million, excuse me. Yeah, 3 million documents and pages of documents that we have so far. And then, of course, the call for more, because there's more, 3 million, and there's more. Yes, there is almost twice as much. So there's more to be learned. We can talk about this forever. We can be critical. And the other day, Pam Bondi, Attorney General, really took heat on some of that because everybody wanted to talk about the Epstein files, and that's understandable. But I think it is important to recognize that it also spells the end of the influence of the Clintons. And that's why Byron York, writing his piece, again with the Washington Examiner, said the Clintons are so over. And he says, after years of scandal, former President Bill Clinton is caught up in the Jeffrey Epstein revelations, you think? Last August, the House Committee on Government Reform sent Clinton a subpoena based on the travel on Epstein's airplane, was that the Lolita Express, I think they called it, on alleged contact with Epstein's victims and, of course, the closeness to Ghislaine Maxwell. A recipient of a congressional subpoena, actually, might think it unnecessary, but you better be careful because we can point to many people. Just ask Steve Bannon, Peter Navarro, and others that suffered a consequence. So the committee originally asked for Clinton to appear for a deposition October 14th, 2025. Well, you know that didn't happen. Then they moved the date up to December 17th, 2025. You know, that didn't happen. So then they had a follow-up subpoena because he had supposedly funerals and things like that for January 13th, 2026. He did not show up. And, of course, Hillary Clinton did not show up either. I think we all know what's going on. And what's going on is that the people that have maybe been willing to turn a blind eye to Bill and Hillary Clinton because they were in power are recognizing probably not necessary now. I've oftentimes said we may learn a lot more about what happened during the Clinton administration and their lives once they no longer have any kind of power. But even when he was out of power, President Clinton, former President Clinton, had a lot of power. Hillary Clinton was what? Later Secretary of State, presidential candidate. But that, I think, is illustrated by the fact that just about a week or two ago, the House Oversight Committee, which is made up of 25 Republicans and 21 Democrats, all voted to hold Bill Clinton in contempt. Now, to be fair, I believe all 25 of the Republicans voted, and so did 9 of the Democrats. So you still had a significant number of Democrats that didn't. 2 others voted present. But I think it illustrates the case that the lesson here, according to Byron York, is that these Democrats are starting to recognize there's really nothing to be gained by continuing to support Bill and Hillary Clinton. And so we ask the question, why so many Democrats, half of the Democrats on the committee, and again, that's not quite half, although if you count the 2 present, that's, I guess, get you up to 11, so that gets you half, vote against the Democratic legends because they're more and ready to move on. And so we saw, whereas before there may be a willingness to line up behind Bill and Hillary Clinton, now we're starting to recognize that is changing rather dramatically. And also at this point, you have some statements being made, for example, by one individual. At this point, there's nothing but baggage. This comes from an anonymous Democratic lobbyist. Given the party's many problems, the lobbyist said the Clintons' continued presence is a barrier to the party's renewal. Another Democrat, one that's was an advisor, told Politico, "What is the political usefulness of the Clintons these days? We all just got behind the Epstein transparency because it made Trump uncomfortable. What are you going to say now? Everyone must answer for this, but the Clintons?" And interestingly enough, one that would go on record was Maxwell Frost. He's a Democrat from Florida. He said, "We want to be more aggressive and find the truth. It's less about allegiances to, individuals and more about what's best for our party and what's best for our country." Well, let's give credit to at least some of the Democrats that have come this direction, but I think it illustrates this is going to be an ongoing issue, and it already has been. Interestingly enough, Byron York ends by saying, in the House as a whole, all these Democrats and all but one Republican voted in order to the Justice Department to release the Epstein files. At its core, the vote was fundamentally about President Donald Trump, with Democrats hoping there would be revelations that would damage the president. But the votes also served to show their 2 Democratic legends, the Clintons, are fading fast and no longer major figures in their party. I'm sure we'll be talking about the Clintons, but in a different sort of way. And if you've taken the time to look at the Epstein files, you, of course, come away with some of the comments I just made. You realize that these are individuals in their emails with great disdain for the hoi polloi, the plebeians, just the general Americans, and who believe that they are sort of above the law and they're above these people. You also recognize that the Justice Department, quite frankly, did a crummy job of dealing with all the kind of various redactions that could have and should have taken place. And also you have these victims that are calling for the release of more so that we can name those particular perpetrators, but they know who they are right now. The argument always has been, well, they wouldn't want to name the perpetrators because then they'd be involved in a court case. But Elon Musk solved that the other day on X, formerly known as Twitter. He said, "I will back and pay for any of the court cost of any of these victims speaking out against the perpetrators." And if those perpetrators are walking amongst us right now, if some of them are serving in government right now, if some of them are scot-free, I think it's time to get that information out. And certainly transparency is one aspect, but just a willingness on some of the victims who we already know, some of who've already identified themselves because they were part of the Me Too movement and everything else, to have them come and speak out and deal with the Epstein files. We'll be talking about this a lot more in the future, but I thought at least end with that comment because I think the Clintons are over, and that's probably a good thing for American politics. Let's again thank Megan for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow on our Friday weekend edition right here on Point of View.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.